Yeah.
So what are the big stories of this part of the city?
Well, you have a bit of everything here. You know, you have the Romans, you've got this a Viking part of the city. You've got the Normans who build this enormous castle on the site. You then have that swept away over the years. A prison is built within part of the castle precinct. That's swept away again, and in the 20th century, the whole thing or part of the site, becomes a car park. So when you take Piccadilly and you take York Castle, the car park area, you've actually got a little bit of everything of York's archaeology and urban history represented on this site. So it's really exciting in that respect. But I think what that actually demonstrates is that York has developed through these periods of intense activity. So you have this agrarian landscape before the Romans arrive. I like to think of the cows drinking out of the river, the trees growing, the fields full of crops, little farmsteads scattered around, and then the Romans arrive, and everything changes. The Romans may have chosen this spot for a particular reason. They may have decided that, or they may have found out that this area, which we now call York, was already a significant place for these Iron Age tribes. Now, such is the depth of deposit over the top of where those deposits might survive, such is the degree of later disturbance that we have no idea what prehistoric deposits underlie the Romans. But the Romans change everything. That's when you can start to talk about York as an urban centre. It sort of reaches this sort of stasis, and then the Vikings arrive, and again everything changes. They lay the place out according to they divide the street frontages up into neat tenement plots, and they remain traceable in the townscape down to this day. So if you walk along Fossgate and Walmgate, you will see these narrow tenement plots, and they all have their origins in that period when the Vikings arrive in the late 9th, early 10th century and start laying out and dividing up land in the city. When the Normans arrive, you have this further period of transformation between 1066 and 1100. Two castles are built. The Minster is rebuilt as a Norman cathedral. St Mary's Abbey is established. This Domus Regis, which lies underneath West Officers, is built. We don't know what that is, what form it took, but you have these huge, significant new builds in the townscape. They build a dam across the River Foss, flood the Foss Valley to provide the water defences for the castle. In doing so, they create this huge fish pool, the King's Fish Pool, which dominates the whole east side of the city. So again, another transformational episode. And then the city accommodates all of these changes. People get used to what's going on. Bits of pieces are filled in. And then, with the dissolution of the monasteries, which does affect this area to some extent, because the outer bailey of York Castle in the 13th century was given to the Augustinian friars, and they built their friary on this site. That becomes a major element of the medieval town. And in the 1530s, of course, that's what wrapped up, the land sold off, and so you start to get 16th century houses, which in the 17th century you see the emergence of these rather grand houses in this area. Cumberland House down on King's Staithe, Fairfax House behind us here, the other John Carr mansion, the Masonic Lodge in Castlegate, and the now lost mansion which stood on the site of the car park, which included, can you believe, the Mott and Clifford's Tower in its garden as this sort of monumental folly. Fancy having that in your back garden. Staggering. Anyway, so that rolls on, and then you have the construction of the prison in the 19th century in the car park. And that 19th century development is all tied up with the coming of the railways. This, another of these transformational episodes in the development of York. And the railways, we still, I think, coming to grips with what mass transport means in terms of living in urban places. And I think the city is still assimilating, the outcomes from that episode of the railways transforming large parts of the city between 1830 and 1880. And the interesting thing about all of this is that, of course, when you start to look at redevelopment in a place like the Castle Gateway, Piccadilly Castle Car Park, this area behind me, you've got to try and sort of assimilate and think, well, what does all that mean in terms of what we can do in this space? How do you build that into your decision-making process? What do you give value to? What has more value than something else? And I think that's an interesting conversation that needs to be brought out as part of this process.
I wanted to a question amongst that about, you talk in a very positive way about change, which is interesting. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the kind of relationship between planning and change, because obviously those changes that have happened on the way have been, well, I'd be interested to know how much you think they were planned, or how much, and if there is another kind of period of transformation coming up for this area, how much should we plan that? How much should we kind of let it develop in organic ways?
Yeah, I think you can look at all of these transformational episodes, and at each point you can see that there was clearly a concept behind what they wanted to achieve. Now, whether they would regard that, the Romans, the Vikings, the Normans, whether they would have regarded that as planning, I don't know. But you can clearly see what we would call concepts of planning lying behind those decisions to do what they did. So that's right. So the Romans laying out a fortress, that is a planned episode. They have a framework which they use everywhere. They bring it here, they drop it down in this place, and then around that there develops a mix of organic development and further planned developments, which the Romans, through their sort of military industrial might, drive forward. So in each of these transformational episodes you can see concepts that are somewhat similar to the concept of planning today. Now, those interventions, those episodes, Normans, Vikings, and Romans, I think what you can see there is that these are very autocratic, elite interventions. So there would be no consultation. There would be no concept of a democratic debate. This is what we're doing, like it or lump it. And that's certainly the case with the Romans, certainly the case with the Normans. And we know that when the Vikings came, it was not a peaceful assimilation in the first years, and that there was subsequently, there was a lot of social and military upheavals going on in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. I think looking at that and thinking about what's happening today, clearly these transformational episodes in the past have created the city that we live in today. So if we didn't have the Romans, we didn't have the Vikings putting their stuff in, we didn't have the Normans doing what they did, we didn't have the dissolution of the monasteries and the developments that rolled out from that, if the railways hadn't come, York would not be York. York is the accumulation of all of those decisions that were taken at those points in time by powerful elites that have then been lived in and have developed organically in the periods in between by the people who live here. So York today is the expression of lots of decisions that have been taken in the past. I think we stand at a point in time where you have significant change going to happen again. You know, the local plan, if that goes forward, that's going to what? In 15, 20 years, perhaps have more than 30, 40,000 additional people living in the area. That's like a 25% increase in population. You know, this is a point of significant change, and I know people understandably get quite worried by this. But I think when you look back at the way that York has developed previously, I think you can see that York's success has been that these changes have happened, and then the city has assimilated them, and life has grown, and these new elements have become part of what makes York special.
So it's a mixture of a kind of structure which comes in from outside and then what people do with it.
Well, I mean, structure is one thing, but you know, people are a greater aspect, because it's the people that make a place, and people give life to structure. I mean, structure can frame how people react. You know, they frame spaces in which people move. They provide different opportunities, but actually, ultimately, it's about the people. And in the past, the people have been excluded. You know, the local Iron Age tribes had no say in what happened when the Romans came. And similarly, the inhabitants of Jorvik had very little say over what the Normans did when they came and imposed their changes on the city. Now, we should have a framework where people can have a say in what they want to happen in a place, and the decision makers ought to be able to come up with a framework that reflects, incorporates what people want in a place, which marks out this transformational episode as fundamentally different from anything that's happened before.
Sometimes heritage is seen as stopping change,
Yeah.
being in a sense preservation
Yeah,
in
yeah,
a particular
that's right,
moment.
yeah.
I mean, how do you think the best way of thinking about heritage is for York?
I mean, you're right. I mean, conservation, archaeology, heritage is often perceived as being a constraint, this negative. You would expect me to say this, but I take the opposite view, because I see conservation as being not about how do we preserve this place, how do we stop change happening, but I see conservation as actually being the positive management of change. It's saying, okay, we have all of these things. We can't take everything with us into the future. We've got to throw some things away, because we've got to put what we want into this place. You know, we've got to put our page in the book. And for me, conservation, heritage, is about how you structure those discussions, how you structure those decisions, so that you can try and get to a place where you are having a positive impact on what you take with you into the future. So for me, it's about, you know, managing change. It's about making sure that change happens, but that change is carried out in such a way that you don't throw away all of the things that you value as you move forward.